So in the last few years, there's been a push on the right to promote a notion of colourblindness. A colourblind society that doesn't see colour, but the person, the individual, the character, and we should seek to focus on things beyond race and just, in a way, kind of just transcend race. And intuitively, this seems like a very appealing and positive idea. Let's deal with race relations that have been quite antagonistic in the last decades. I mean, you could say really goes back at least 3 or 4 centuries. How do we deal with this? Well, let's go beyond race and try and, in a way, not see race. So colourblind, you are literally not seeing a person's race. But the problem is, we have a whole lot of data. We've tried this for at least 20, 30 years, and it simply doesn't work. In reality, by ignoring racial disparities in education, the economy, the workplace, you just perpetuate the imbalances. You don't actually directly confront them and build policies that are based on the imbalances. You just kind of ignore them and they just either get worse or stay the same. So, in fact, the notion of colourblindness is a very convenient tool to ignore race and not really talk about it. Because in the last 10 years in the culture war, conservatives are trying to argue that, we're not racist, we just have concerns about culture. But they can't argue it because they are literally isolating certain races that they don't want in the country. They are perpetuating economic systems that disproportionately impact people of colour in the UK and America. And the left are asking, okay, so how do we deal with this? How do we redress the balance? Reparations, how do we fund urban areas that have been deprived? How do we deal with the drug war? How do we deal with systemic racism? These are big questions, and we talk a lot about them in the culture war, and things have got better in the last few decades, and they will continue to improve. But in the last 10 years or so, things have got a little bit worse. Coleman Hughes, on his TED talk about his book, when he talks about colourblindness, says that up until the late 90s, early 2000s, race relations were getting better. And then in about 2016, they started to decline. And then it's interesting, he doesn't analyse what happened in 2016. Well, Donald Trump was elected. A man that was supported by the Ku Klux Klan, endorsed by the Ku Klux Klan, became president. He was calling Mexicans rapists and a whole slew of racism over the last at least 10 years, going beyond, even going back to the 80s, where he wouldn't lease or rent properties out to black families. So Donald Trump unequivocally is a racist. So by electing someone who is racist, you kind of give people permission to, conservatives who maybe, would silently be racist and not talk about their racist beliefs. It gave the kind of permission to be a bit more explicit in their racism and talk about how things that have been maybe simmering under the surface for decades kind of exploded. And we did have that era of the 90s, early 2000s, that after the fall of communism, capitalism won, the end of history, we kind of did have a time of depoliticization where we didn't really talk. I mean, they were on the margins, but it wasn't mainstream. Feminism wasn't in the mainstream. Trans rights, black rights, they wasn't in the mainstream. Academics were talking about it. But then, after the 2008 crash, economic decline, people's lives, it bubbled up out of the unconscious, the collective psyche. And now we're having to deal with it. So it's very convenient to say, we're colourblind. Let's not look at colour. Let's just treat people. And to be fair, there are moves to look at these disparities based on class. And I think that's a good idea. I think we should fund communities that are more deprived based on class. I think that's actually really productive. But that still doesn't address the racial imbalances that are specific to particular racial groups, like Jewish groups, Indian groups, black groups. Individuals have different forms of racism towards them, and it's very subtle and nuanced. For example, in education, a lot of this is unconscious bias, which makes it even more difficult to tackle. You just have to make people aware and educate people on their own biases. So, for example, in education, a young black boy or girl is more likely to be treated more harshly for misbehaving. Also, related to that is that they're often seen as older and perceived as more mature. So obviously they're going to have a different standard on their behaviour. They should be more mature. This is an unconscious bias that teachers will have. The data's been looked at for years. And how do we isolate this? Well, the only way really is to talk about this education. We all have unconscious biases, but we need to talk about it. It's not by ignoring it and saying, oh, race doesn't exist. That's too late now. For 400 years, race has been a key component of capitalism and the divisions of labour and how we see ourselves and other people. So we can't just now ignore it. And I mean, I'd love to. I think we should get rid of it. I'm a race abolitionist. So am I in terms of gender. I don't like gender. I don't like race. These are not useful constructs. But we've got them now. And we have to be honest and talk about how people are treated differently because they're a woman, because they're a homosexual, because they're trans, and often, again, it's unconscious, but we have to have this conversation. And colourblindness just doesn't work. It just ignores the problem and just makes it worse. So comment below, how do we deal with the temptation to fall into colourblindness when it just reproduces the problem? How do we go beyond kind of the culture war? Because people on the right get very upset by being called out for their racism, and they throw back that, oh, we're the true racists. That's not an argument. How do you deal with this? I really struggle, because you can't have a true debate because it's not good faith. By saying, oh, just ignore it, we're colourblind, racism doesn't exist. What did they say that was racist? Well, it was a whole of racist dog whistles. Well, in the era of racist dog whistles, it is harder to expose racism, because that's the point. The dog whistle conceals the racism in a coded language. So how do you expose it? And especially because it's unconscious, it's systemic, it's very difficult. But colourblindness, I don't believe, is the answer. So comment below, what are your thoughts on colourblindness? Is colourblindness racist? Is it the solution? And I'll see you in the next video.